Hello all, this is the Owl, and holy crap did this script get out of control. As I've been threatening to do for a while now, we'll be looking at my top 20, top 30, sod it, top 50 manga of all time. While naturally, this will have more of a lean towards horror, seinen, and the slightly darker and heavier shonen, because, well, this is me. Unlike my other content, this will not be bound by genre or target demographic. It's purely based on how, well, good these manga are, at least in my opinion. Before we start, a few rules. First up, I'm only going to put manga I've actually read on here. If there's something obvious missing, assume that it's one of the many manga that's been on my to-read list for a while now, and I just haven't gotten around to it. Or it's something I read ages ago and don't remember much of. Yes, before you ask, Goblin Slayer, Omniscient Readers something, Blame, a bunch of Fate stuff, Houseki no Kuni, Kingdom, and frigging JoJo are on this other list, and we'll get to those when we get to them. Secondly, once again, this is an open rating, meaning that basically anything I've read is fair game, so expect quite a variety. Thirdly, yes, I am going to be critical in places, especially further down, up. You know what I mean. The lower numbers on the list. However, keep in mind that anything on this list is worth reading and is at least definitely good. Finally, of course, this is not an objective list. It's going to be purely what I've come up with, meaning that I've probably forgotten to put at least 5 really good ones on there. And there'll be a few you'll likely disagree with. That's completely fine, and you're more than welcome to put your own picks in the comments. Who knows, I might even find something interesting to read. Today, we'll be taking a look at the first lot. Let's get cracking. At number 50, Corpse Party. I've already said my piece on this one, at least in my deep dive series. But for the uninitiated, Corpse Party is a manga adaptation of one of the first and one of the most iconic Japanese horror video games of all time. One that spawned a minor horror franchise of spin-offs, light novels, sequels, remakes, movies, and anime. It was, in many respects, as important as Resident Evil and Ringu for the Japanese horror genre. And it's good-ish, which is why it's at 50. A bunch of school kids and their teachers are transported to another dimension, consisting of an ancient, rather haunted junior high school, and they must find their way back to each other, as well as how to escape, which will naturally entail learning the truth and solving the mystery of exactly why a certain little girl in a red dress is haunting the place. On one hand, the art is pretty damn boss in places. The atmosphere and the setting are fantastic, and there's plenty of blood and guts for the gorehounds. But on the other, a sluggish second act, some really irritating characters and decisions, a complete lack of subtlety, and some mildly gross plot points that come up later mean that while I did enjoy reading it, and probably will reread it again in the future, it's not going to be topping the list. It's also not scary in the least. Instead, it's just kind of cruel and sad. However, if you are interested in a spooky, often nasty and mean-spirited little yarn set in a rotting, ancient school, the setting and the atmosphere alone may just make this one worthwhile. Crawling into spot number 49, Ringu. Man, what a weird series this is. I'll probably get around to doing a deep dive on the Ringu mangas eventually. I'm currently just looking for legal copies of 2 of them. But yeah, I don't think Ringu needs any introduction. The image of the spoopy, long-haired ghost girl is as iconic now as Jason Voorhees or the Xenomorph. The manga adaptations are rather an unusual animal, as they draw from both the films and the original novels, meaning that quite a few details are rather different, and some of the nastier, darker twists and turns, particularly as they pertain to Sadako's backstory, are retained. At the end of the day, it's really good. It's not especially scary or shocking, and a story that I think a lot of people are rather familiar with now, considering how much of a sleeper hit the film series turned out to be. But it's a damn fine series of adaptations that are just different enough from the films and novels to be worth checking out in their own right. And suddenly appearing in spot number 48, Tanabe Go's H.P. Lovecraft Adaptations. This one was really hard to place. On one hand, holy crap is this done well. Probably the best Lovecraft adaptation that I can think of, to be honest. On the other hand, it's not an original series, and it's also a pretty strict adaptation in terms of staying very true to the original Lovecraft stories, both for good and for ill. Tanabe Go essentially adapted a whole bunch of Lovecraft stuff into manga form, with absolutely gorgeous art and some genuinely creepy sequences. You've got most of his good stories here. Everything from Color Out of Space to my personal favorite, At the Mountains of Madness. And Gore did a damn fine job of this. However, as it really is just an adaptation, especially an adaptation that I'm sure most horror fans are intimately familiar with, I'm reluctant to put it any higher than this. Still, absolutely worth tracking down, particularly if you're like me and just can never get enough cosmic horror in your life. And once again, the art is so impressive that it probably justifies a read on its own, perfectly capturing the eeriness and otherworldly dread that defined Lovecraft's works, and in places even somehow improving on them. Teleporting in to position 47, Fairy Tail. Speaking of complicated manga, this was one that I was debating putting on this list at all, but after rereading it, I decided, yeah. Why? Well, let me try to explain. Fairy Tail tells the story of Natsu Dragneel, a dragon slayer wizard from the titular fairy tale guild on a generic fantasy quest in a generic fantasy world with generic shonen goals and generic shonen characters. And oh boy, when I say generic, I am not kidding. I mean, you've got all the tropes. The stick-in-the-mud rival character with a tragic backstory, check. The tough-as-nails and yet motherly female companion, check. The cutesy comedic relief animal sidekick, check. And, oh, did I nearly bail on this one multiple times. Because for the first, well, literal half of the manga, it's basically a lesser One Piece clone with a smattering of Dragon Ball, but way less interesting. Then, maybe halfway through, something happened, and the story suddenly gets really creative, astonishingly dark, and pretty damn good. And I ended up burning straight through to the end. And when I got there, I was actually rather sad that there wasn't more of it. So, yeah, it's a bit of a tough recommendation, because you've got a real slog to get to the good stuff. But I guess A, that's a lot of long-form shonen series, even the ones I unironically love, and B, the good stuff is so surprisingly good that it's frankly worth it. Yeah, it's fight after fight, but when Fairy Tail suddenly starts listening to black metal and drinking neat scotch out of a demon skull, well, you'll see what I mean. Go and check it out if you're in the mood for a manga that's light-hearted, but also goes to some really unexpectedly mature places. Like, holy crap, how is this still Shonen Jump mature? Creeping into number 46, Hideout. I think I've mentioned this one before. It's a shortish manga residing firmly somewhere in the 80s rural slasher headspace. A couple having, let's say, serious marital issues get stuck on an isolated island where they find themselves hunted by a mysterious cannibalistic killer. And yeah, I can't really say too much more, as this is one I don't want to spoil. Aside from the fact that the art is bloody incredible, the story is briskly paced, and if you're looking for some really, really dark and at times shocking stuff with a nearly perfect atmosphere, this nasty little story delivers on all fronts. Bouncing into 45, Monster Musume no Iru Nichijo. Yup, I know that a whole bunch of you are wondering if I got the title wrong. There must be some mistake. A slice of life ecchi comedy on the Fright Ranker channel? I get it. Believe it or not, I read this one as part of a deal with someone else. They had to read the number 2 entry on this list, which we'll get to eventually. And I had to read this. And I won't lie, I really wasn't keen initially. But damn it, this one won me over in a big way, and I ended up binging it straight through over a weekend. The setup is actually really clever. Kimihito Kurusu is a good-natured young man who winds up being mistakenly sent a, well, let's not beat around the bush here, a sexy, buxom snake girl, what a weird phrase to say, as part of a Japanese cultural exchange program. Before too long, he winds up hosting a whole bunch of these creatures, sort of human-animal or human-mythological creature hybrids, including a ditzy harpy, an uptight centaur, a romance-obsessed mermaid, and a... yeah, where do I even start on the Spider-Girl Arachne? I believe the correct collective noun is a harem of monster girls. And this is only made worse when he's told that he will need to pick one of these girls as a wife, leading, of course, to endless, mildly horny hijinks, comedic misunderstandings, and a whole bunch of bouncing boobage. And you know what? I would say it's probably the breast ecchi that I've ever read. Wait, what did I just say? Okay. In all seriousness, this could so easily just have been another horny-ass slice-of-life story, I guess with human hybrid designs. But there are a few things that manage to elevate the story substantially. The entire setup being a metaphor for Japan's own exchange programs and their society's complicated relationship between their traditional isolationism and the modern need for internationalization, as well as Japan's own cultural exchange programs. The characters are really bloody likable, well-defined, and play off each other in some pretty damn funny and endearing ways. And yeah, when I say really funny, I mean it. I am not an easy laugh, and this one made me burst out laughing a whole bunch. If you're in the mood for something light, extremely randy, and yet inexplicably endearing, I don't think you can do much better than this one. It's the absolute tits. Just keep in mind, this is not one for the kiddlywinks. Oh right, massive monster memories. That is all. Next, dripping into position 44, Magical Girl Sight. And this one is on completely the other end of the spectrum, as, wow, is this one an edgy boy, loosely intended as a companion series to the almost as edgy Magical Girl Apocalypse, and penned by the king of edge himself, Kentaro Sato. This one caused a bit of a ruckus when the anime debuted, and yeah, I can see why. Aya Asagiri is an unfortunate girl subject to horrific bullying and abuse, both at home and at school, but is offered magical powers by a creepy-ass website. After she accepts, she accidentally kills the bullies and finds herself drawn into a bizarre conflict between magical girls, magic hunters, and an approaching apocalypse. It's also probably the most Kentaro Sato manga that Kentaro Sato has ever written, which means that it's so absurdly dark and squicky that it almost comes out the other side into being funny. If I thought Kentaro Sato had any self-awareness whatsoever, I'd probably call this a parody of the whole dark magical girl subgenre that sits under the actual magical girl genre like an ostrich egg under a sparrow. That said, it's actually kind of good, or to put it more accurately, there's some really, really good stuff in here. Well-defined core characters, some genuinely affecting and sad moments, and it's well-structured, well-paced, and well-executed. On the other hand, yeah, it's Kentaro Sato, so know what you're getting into. If you're a fan of really dark, really bloody, and really edgy manga, this one is going to be right up your alley. And for what it is, I'll admit to enjoying it, and I can see myself reading it again, which is rare. Take that for what it's worth. punching its way into spot 43, we have Shamo, another series that I've said my piece on in its own video, quite recently actually. Shamo takes a lot of what you're expecting from a bog-standard martial arts rags to riches story and flips it on its head. Essentially, it's Rocky 3, but told from the perspective of Clubber Lang. Ryo Narushima is sentenced to a brutal juvenile prison facility after suffering a psychotic break and stabbing his parents to death. In there, after, you can guess what happens. He winds up learning a lethal form of karate and, on release, emerges as a spectacularly broken, extremely violent man that develops an obsession with defeating the heavyweight kickboxing champion Naoto Sugawara, a perfect foil for Narushima. Handsome, good, noble, and well-liked. As Sugawara continues to ignore him, Narushima resorts to truly horrific means to get Sugawara's attention. The two get their bout, and yeah, it's pretty damn amazing. Of course, this is maybe the first third of the manga, and for what it is, it's really excellent. However, thanks to conflict and drama between the writer and the artist regarding ownership of the manga and its characters, eventually leading to a full-on lawsuit between them and control passing back and forth, the rest of Shamo is a gigantic, impenetrable mess, basically worth skipping. Grab the proper Shamo, ignore the rest, and you'll have a good time. Just keep in mind, this is not a nice story. Slowly floating into spot 42, Hellstar Remina. Yeah, if we're going to talk about divisive manga, we can't really do it without Mr. Ito here. Junji Ito. Some folks love you, some folks don't, and others like myself somehow manage to find a spot right between these 2 points. Ito is both talented and prolific, likely the only modern horror mangaka to be a household name even outside of Japan. And yeah, when Junji Ito is on, he's on. His short-form stories tend to be both wildly creative and occasionally terrifying. His longer works tend to have a lot of good stuff in them and also start strong, but by the end, they have flown so far off into the wibbly-woos that they've turned into incomprehensible nonsense. However, every now and then, Junji Ito lands an absolute haymaker. Enter Hellstar Remina. The setup is simple and bonkers. A scientist discovers an anomalous new planet that does not seem to obey the laws of physics and names it after his daughter, the titular Remina, which turns her into a celebrity overnight. However, it turns out that the planet is actually a gigantic Lovecraftian monstrosity that's heading to Earth to basically eat it. Panic ensues as the world turns on Remina as a scapegoat. And while, like most long-form Junji Ito stories, it goes completely snooker-loopy by the end, this sort of works due to the already insane basal concept. Even the ambiguous downer ending works, as it's kind of a staple of cosmic horror. Hellstar is an interesting story, in that it can be read many ways, as a critique of the nature of hereditary celebrity and how we relate to it as a society, or just as a sci-fi horror story about a giant evil tentacle planet, and it works on both levels. It's an easy one to find. Go give it a read if you haven't. Casting its way into 41, Fullmetal Alchemist. Ooh, it's time to get myself into some trouble. The story is pretty creative. Two brothers, Edward and Alphonse, attempt an alchemical ritual to resurrect their dead mother, and this goes all kinds of horribly wrong, resulting in Edward losing limbs and Alphonse losing his entire body, having his soul bound to a suit of armor. Their goal becomes to eventually restore Alphonse's body and put things right. Over time, they join a rich cast of characters, generally other alchemists, and come into conflict with the homunculi, powerful individuals named after the 7 deadly sins. Fullmetal Alchemist is one of the manga you'll see topping best of lists pretty much all over the place, and it's frequently considered to be the best shonen manga of all time. And, don't get me wrong, I like Fullmetal Alchemist, but I don't love it. The good stuff is really good, and the first third of the story kicks every inch of the ass. It's clever, well-paced, and, especially for shonen of the era, extraordinarily dark. But things sort of fall apart as the plot continues and kind of spirals in on itself, with just too many characters, side plots, and a weird big bad that I just didn't find interesting. Whenever I reread this thing, I tend to get halfway in and then lose interest. However, again, before people start leaving flaming bags of poop at my door, there is some truly great stuff in here, including, one of the original manga is for kids, lol, dark moments memes. I don't think that Fullmetal Alchemist is the masterpiece that apparently everyone else does. That doesn't mean that it's not worth a read, because it is, as is everything on this list. It's a damn good manga. Transforming its way into spot 40 is Bleach. Oh yeah. Speaking of getting myself into trouble, it's time to really put the cat amongst the pigeons with what is, was, and probably will always be a very divisive manga, with fans on one side that love it and people on the other side that have an active screaming dislike for it. So yeah, Bleach. Where do I even start? While it has faded from relevancy somewhat, almost to the extent of being memory holed by a lot of people, there was a time when Bleach was the shit. It was everywhere, almost at the level of stuff like Naruto and One Piece. And yet, few people realize that the story behind it is almost as interesting as the story itself. Troubled and struggling mangaka Noriaki Tite Kubo had just had his first manga cancelled after 27 chapters, and when he submitted his next idea to Shonen Jump, was rejected. However, Akira frigging Toriyama intervened to encourage him. Jump took a chance with this weird-ass story about Shinigami, and it became a monster hit. The story, heavily inspired by Saint Seiya, is odd. Ichigo, a punk teenager, finds himself drawn into the world of the Shinigami, which directly translates into gods of death, but in all the Western versions I've encountered, Soul Reapers, both of which are pretty damn cool. The Shinigami are spiritual soldiers charged with handling matters pertaining to death, as well as defending the living world against incursions or hauntings by creatures called hollows, corrupted, lost souls. After a Shinigami called Rukia is badly injured, the mortal Ichigo receives her power and ends up being able to transform into a Shinigami with all of their abilities, including, the hook of the story and probably the thing most people liked best, the living, transforming weapons known as Zanpakuto, capable of ascending into different forms, all of which are absurdly powerful and at times straight up bizarre. Bleach has run, and my feelings towards it are complicated. It started, let's be honest here, pretty damn bad. Monster of the Week stuff with a gradually expanding cast of characters and powers, all bookended by a bog-standard slice-of-life high school setting. Then things got interesting, as other Shinigami take Rukia prisoner and leave Ichigo on the verge of death, alongside his friends, including the stalwart Chad. Yeah, that name will never not make me laugh. Obvious love interest Orihime, and the mysterious archer Ishida. Ichigo must find his way into Soul Society to free Rukia, and to solve the mystery of exactly why she was captured. This is where the story got good, as we meet, by a mile, the most interesting thing about the manga, the other Shinigami, particularly the lieutenants and captains of the various squads. Characters like the haughty but extremely powerful Byakuya, the sinister Gin, and my personal favorite, the battle-addicted mad bastard Zaraki, really made the story tick. For a bit. Eventually, after getting his Bankai, his final, most powerful transformed sword, and yes, a great deal of this manga is Bankai Blue Balls, Ichigo frees Rukia, defeats the captains, and the story immediately enters the second arc, as this all turns out to have been set up by a treacherous group of Shinigami, led by the absurdly powerful Captain Aizen. Yeah, spoilers, this thing's 20 years old now. Turns out Aizen wants to surpass the power of Shinigami by hybridizing them with hollows, and Ichigo must learn to work with the other Shinigami and figure out how to beat this new threat. This forms a lengthy and I would consider to be the best storyline in the manga, culminating in an apocalyptic battle between Ichigo and Aizen. If this all sounds amazing, it really is. It's a bit light on the characterization, but it's heavy on the kick-ass battles, and sometimes that's completely fine. But then, without too many spoilers, we get our final battle. Ichigo makes a massive sacrifice to win, Aizen is defeated, and we get a genuinely sweet, if somewhat melancholy ending. Had that been it, I think Bleach would have been remembered a lot more fondly. However, it wasn't. Likely because of how stupidly popular it was, Kubo continued, giving us the widely hated Fullbring arc, which mostly existed to retcon and thus undermine Ichigo's sacrifice, which totally broke the fantastic end of the last arc. And then we got the final arc, the Blood War, seeing the Shinigami face off against the Quincy's, who are obvious Nazi analogues because Japan. The Blood War arc was not terrible, but man, did it go on for way too long and get tiresome, culminating with a complete fart of a final battle before we get the bog standard, bland, tacked on everyone got married and had kids epilogue. The other problem with Bleach is, I guess, that while it does have some great characters, the main character, the chap we'll be spending most of our time with and should be rooting for, is about as interesting as a bread sandwich. Ichigo is a bland tabula rasa without any personal goals and is thus entirely reactive. Something happens, his friends are threatened, he responds. Weak. His own arc is basically over within the first few volumes. Still, despite this, Bleach is a shonen worth reading. The good characters are great, the battles are amazing, and the transformations alone, well, I must have read this thing a dozen times, so clearly it did something right. But, rereading it now, I can only say it's still great. The stuff about it that I really like, but it has not aged well. Before we wrap this up for the day, I want to give a massive thanks, as always, to my fantastic patrons. Asterix Gaming, Cheerful Satanist, Starwin Marwin, High Lord J, Jacob Ramsey, Crazy, Lance Goebel, Paul Norberger, Piece of Yeast, Rafferty, Robert Dote, and XTC Pill. And I want to give a special welcome to our new Blue Whistle tier, Cal Core. If you want to see more like this, why not stick around? Subscribe, bell, you know what to do. If you want to help myself and Mrs. Owl out, and help to ensure that I can keep doing what I do, why not take a look at our Patreon? You'll also get some fun perks on the Discord, as well as early access to most of my videos. Oh right, Discord is that away. We've got a great community thus far, why not come and join the fun? Otherwise, take care my friends, and cheers. This is the Owl, signing off.